Welcome to the Gun Files. A young American soldier is pinned down in the dense jungle of Vietnam. The enemy is closing in. He pulls the trigger on his brand new rifle, the most advanced infantry weapon the United States military has ever issued. And nothing happens. The bolt is frozen. The action is jammed solid. The weapon that was supposed to give him the technological edge over a poorly equipped enemy force has just become a useless piece of metal and plastic in his hands at the exact moment his life depends on it. This happened not once, not to a handful of unlucky soldiers. It happened on a scale that became one of the most disturbing and most covered-up failures in the history of American military procurement. Soldiers were found dead in the jungles of Vietnam, with their rifles disassembled beside them, having died trying to clear a jam in the middle of a firefight. Letters home described the weapon in terms that should never be used about equipment meant to keep a soldier alive. And the worst part is that the United States military knew about many of these problems before the rifle was ever issued in mass numbers to combat troops. This is the story of the M16, the rifle they called the plastic rifle. The weapon that was supposed to revolutionize American infantry combat and instead became a symbol of bureaucratic failure, corporate cost-cutting, and a generation of soldiers paying the price for decisions made far from the battlefield. Today we go deep into how this happened, the engineering behind the original design, the political fight inside the Pentagon, the fatal decisions about ammunition and cleaning kits, and how a rifle that started as a disaster eventually became one of the most reliable and most produced firearms platforms in modern history. Let's begin. The story starts with a man named Eugene Stoner, a self-taught firearms designer working for a small aerospace and engineering company called Armalite. In the late 1950s, Stoner designed a rifle called the AR-15, built using principles borrowed directly from aerospace engineering. Aluminum alloys instead of heavy forged steel, synthetic polymer furniture instead of wood, a straight-line stock design that reduced muzzle rise during automatic fire. It was lightweight, it was accurate, and it fired a smaller, faster 223 caliber round instead of the heavier 308 round used by the standard American battle rifle of the era. The United States Air Force adopted a version of the rifle first, impressed by its light, weight, and ease of use. But the rifle's real test was about to come in a war that the American military was entering with a fundamentally outdated understanding of the kind of combat it would actually face. In the early 1960s, American military planners were still largely focused on the idea of a large-scale conventional war against the Soviet Union, fought across open terrain at moderate to long range. The standard American rifle at the time was heavy, powerful, and designed for exactly that kind of fight. But Vietnam was nothing like that. Vietnam was close-range jungle combat, often fought at distances under 50 meters, where a lightweight rifle capable of rapid, controllable automatic fire was a far more practical tool than a heavy battle rifle designed for long-range engagements. The Army adopted a modified version of the AR-15, designating it the M16, and began issuing it to combat units in Vietnam starting in 1965 and 1966. And this is where the story turns from an engineering success into one of the darkest chapters in American military history. The original AR-15 design called for a specific type of gunpowder, a stick powder that burned relatively cleanly and was compatible with the rifle's direct impingement gas system, a system that vents hot combustion gas directly back into the rifle's action to cycle the bolt, rather than using a separate piston like many other rifle designs. This direct impingement system worked beautifully with the correct ammunition. It was lightweight, it had fewer moving parts, and it was inherently more accurate because it didn't have a piston banging around disturbing the rifle's harmonics during firing. But when the rifle was adopted for mass military production, the Army's ammunition procurement made a critical change. Without properly consulting Stoner or Armalite engineers, military ammunition contractors switched the propellant from the original stick powder to a ball powder, a different manufacturing process that was cheaper and more readily available in mass quantities from existing American gunpowder manufacturing infrastructure. This single decision, made largely for reasons of cost and supply chain logistics, would prove catastrophic. The ball powder burned dirtier than the original stick powder, and it generated significantly higher cyclic rates and more fouling residue inside the rifle's gas system. In the brutal humidity and heat of the Vietnamese jungle, this fouling built up rapidly inside the rifle's action, gumming up the bolt carrier group and causing the weapon to fail to extract spent cartridge casings. The case would become so stuck inside the chamber from carbon buildup and corrosion that soldiers couldn't even use the rifle's cleaning rod to push it out under fire. And here is where the failure becomes almost unforgivable. The original rifles issued to combat troops were not equipped with cleaning kits. The Army had been told, based on early marketing claims from the manufacturer, that the rifle was effectively self-cleaning and required minimal maintenance. Soldiers in the field had no brushes, no solvent, no rods, nothing to maintain a weapon that was, in the wet and filthy conditions of jungle warfare, absolutely requiring regular and thorough cleaning to function reliably. Compounding this disaster, many of the early M16 rifles were manufactured without chrome lining in the chamber and barrel, a feature that helps resist corrosion and makes fouling easier to remove. This was originally specified by Stoner's design but was cut during production, again largely for cost reasons. Without chrome lining, the raw steel chamber corroded rapidly in humid jungle conditions, and corrosion combined with carbon fouling created a chamber surface that gripped spent brass cartridges with terrifying tenacity. Soldiers began writing home, and some of those letters eventually reached members of Congress, describing rifles that jammed constantly, that required soldiers to literally beat the bolt forward with a cleaning rod or even a tent stake to chamber a new round, weapons that became useless exactly when soldiers needed them most. In the middle of close-range firefights against North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, who were often armed with the famously reliable AK-47, a rifle deliberately engineered for crude battlefield reliability, above all else, the contrast became deeply demoralizing. American soldiers, equipped with what was marketed as cutting-edge advanced technology, were being outperformed in basic weapon reliability by an enemy using a rifle designed by Soviet engineers specifically to function in mud, sand, and neglect. A congressional investigation was launched in 1967, led by a House Armed Services subcommittee that interviewed soldiers, examined supply records, and uncovered a deeply troubling pattern of decisions made for cost and convenience that directly compromised the reliability of a weapon American troops were depending on for their lives. The investigation found that fundamental changes to the propellant, the lack of chrome lining, and critically, the failure to issue cleaning equipment and proper training were directly responsible for the documented failure rates in combat. The fixes that followed were significant. Chrome-lined chambers and barrels became standard. A new buffer system was added to reduce the cyclic rate of fire, putting less stress on the action. Cleaning kits were finally issued as standard equipment, along with mandatory cleaning training for every soldier carrying the rifle. The propellant issue was gradually addressed as manufacturing standards improved and the ammunition supply chain adapted. By the early 1970s, the M16A1, the improved version incorporating these fixes, had become a significantly more reliable weapon. And over the following decades, continuous refinement led to the M16A2. Then variants like the shorter M4 carbine, which became the standard service rifle for the United States military for the better part of the next 50 years, used in conflicts from the Gulf War through Afghanistan and Iraq, earning a reputation for accuracy, modularity, and eventually, reliability that had been catastrophically absent in its earliest combat deployment. But the early failure was never forgotten. It remains one of the starkest case studies in military procurement history of how decisions made in offices far from any battlefield, decisions driven by cost savings, manufacturing convenience, and a failure to properly test a weapons system under realistic combat conditions, can directly translate into soldiers dying in the field. The M16's redemption arc, becoming one of the most successful and enduring rifle platforms in modern military history, does not erase the documented reality that for a period of years in Vietnam, American soldiers were sent into combat with a rifle that could, and did, fail them at the worst possible moment. That is the true story of the M16, not simply a weapon, a case study in how engineering excellence can be undone by bureaucratic shortcuts, and how the consequences of those shortcuts are paid for by the people who have no say in the decision at all.